Welcome back to another episode of The Look Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, to talk all about porn and its effects on individuals and behaviors and also relationships. Because I would say that, of course, it's going to affect the individual the most, but we do see a lot of issues with relationship dynamics, with porn, like excessive porn viewing, and not just excessive, but it's so different now versus even like 20 years ago, right? Absolutely. In terms of access. And I'm not even just talking about like the types of porn that are out there now versus before, but just like literally down to the access. And you know, before it used to be this whole thing, like it was just so different, even just pre-internet, you know, especially, but then even just more recently, like with OnlyFans, right? Which of course we can get into all those different things, but there's just so much more pornographic type content that's easily available that really can be harmful for people when it's not managed and monitored. And this is not a porn shaming episode by any means. This is not to say like, oh my gosh, you should never consume or what. Like that's not what this conversation is about. It's more so understanding its effects on individuals and how it might be affecting you or someone that you know, because this can be really serious. And how frequently would you say that you see couples come to you, or even individuals who talk about this being an issue?
Quite often. I see a lot of individual men who struggle with this a lot more. Usually when I see it within the context of a couple's dynamic, it's because, generally speaking, it's the man who's starting to consume more and more pornography, and so he's less engaged in sex and intimacy within the relationship, and so it's affecting the relationship in those ways. Or he's consuming too much pornography, and so he can't perform sexually, and so it's causing a rift. And so that's usually the dynamic in which it's presented within a therapeutic environment. But for men, most men who are coming to counseling about it, they're starting to recognize that they have a problem with it, that they're watching it too much or in inappropriate places at inappropriate times. It's causing sexual dysfunction or other problems in their life to some degree or capacity, and so they're willing to start to explore it. On a note of like positivity, a lot of the negative side effects of pornography can be reversed just with consistency in treatment and acknowledging where the issues lie and what you need to do to create healthy boundaries and sexual practices in order to restore performance and sexual function and things like that. So again, not a shaming podcast, but one where we're just trying to talk about and enlighten people as to the risks. And we're not going to dive into every single risk. Like, you guys have Google at your disposal. You know, you can just type in porn addiction and the negative consequences and be inundated with 1,000 videos, from Andrew Huberman to, you know, the random YouTuber who puts one out. But we're going to talk about it within, you know, the context of what you see on a typical day-to-day basis from the individual user.
Would you say that you've seen a change, have you seen an uptick in this with clients?
Absolutely, 100%. So, like, if you go back to, like, my generation.
Rick's older,
right? I'm older. You know, I'm in my 40s. So
he's basically dead. he's halfway there.
Almost. Some days
I mean, you pretty much are halfway there for me now.
I am. I'll be 44, so yeah, I don't think I'll live to see 88, like, to be honest.
I hope not.
Thanks, Laura. Such a sweetheart. It's alright. I don't expect to live past 65 anymore. So the fact that you were giving me to 80 at least was a blessing. But yes.
So back in your day.
So back in my day, the way we were exposed to pornography, believe it or not, was you had to have an older brother, an uncle, something who had a Playboy. And so you would sneak into their bedroom, you know, and you would steal it. We had a friend who worked at 7-Eleven. He was a minor. He worked at 7-Eleven. This is back before they actually cared. And one of the things he would do
they care now.
is at 7-Eleven, I don't know if you guys know this or not, for some of the younger generations, they used to sell porn and pornographic magazines and videos at some of the local 7-Elevens. So when he was taking out like the trash and cleaning up, he would, you know, knock a video into the trash bag or a magazine, and he would throw it out. And then like later that night, he would go back, jump into the dumpster, pull out the trash bag, grab the porn, and that one video got passed around between like 5 people. So that was our access. And here's the other part. The only time we got to watch the damn video was when your parents were gone. You had to pop that thing in the VCR, and very quickly handle everything. So it wasn't like this accessible thing. And I think to me, that's probably the biggest difference that you see in terms of pornographic use is the increase over the last 20, 30 years of the accessibility of it. The internet was a huge step forward, right? So it went from Playboy magazines and VHSs and DVDs, which you could only really watch in the privacy of your own home when you had a VCR or DVD player when no one else was around. Now, with the internet and internet porn, it certainly created more outlets, right? Like the average person could start to do pornography or these other little startup companies. So it went from like the top 10 providers to 100 providers. Okay, but even then, you were at least in your house and you were watching it. And then I think with the increase in technology around smartphones, like that's when it really blew up. And not just because you can access pornography on, a website, but because of all the different ways, like you mentioned, OnlyFans, Instagram. Even though Instagram does a pretty good job of filtering its content, there's some pretty racy stuff out there.
That's debatable.
Right? Here's another one for a lot of the parents who are out there, people who are interested in this. Snapchat is a big pornographic distributor at this point. Like, not only do porn stars have Snapchat, but like the average stripper who's trying to build her database up, she just can create content and post it on her Snapchat story, and people can link it and then follow her and then subscribe to it. And this isn't just happening with adults. This is the problem, is that it's targeting kids. It's targeting teenagers. And so one of the issues that we're starting to see is a much earlier sexualization of children, and not just in the perception of like we're sexualizing children. You're not looking at just a 12-year-old. A 12-year-old is now having greater accessibility to sexually explicit material at a much younger age than what they would have earlier. And so their mind is developing with this type of sexual performance and depiction is really what's kind of developing within them. And so they're maturing and growing with this being the model for sexual behavior.
And that's really where the issue is, right? And that's where the issue is in terms of especially like relationship dynamics, because obviously as an adult, you can watch porn and be like, all right, this is not how things normally work, especially in like a healthy relationship. But when you're a kid and you don't have anything else to model that from, right? And that's, again, literally wiring, like all of that. I was like, this is normal. That definitely is where things get, I would say, problematic, as much as I hate that word, but like it gets misused, and like, oh, that's so problematic. But it really is a useful word in certain contexts, right? But especially here. And just even as an adult, I feel like it would just kind of slowly erode how people view things, because like you're just exposed. When you're exposed to something the first time, it's just like exposure therapy, but in like a maladaptive way.
Well, it desensitizes you.
Yeah, so like you're seeing something and you're like, oh, okay, like that one sounds pretty crazy. And then you see it over and over again, and then you're like, well, that's not crazy, I need something more. Right? And that's where kind of it starts to hijack like the dopamine system in terms of like needing this novelty. And it really just kind of like social media plays upon all of those, on those kind of systems. I feel like porn does as well, but in like different ways in terms of like sexual function, right? Like novelty seeking, right? Especially because a lot of people are wired for that. Then it's just like, well, that's just going to be completely taken over when you have the ability to have all these novel experiences, like just how many tabs down, or with these different people that you're subscribing to, right? Like, oh, I'm subscribed to 5 different OnlyFans, and they're all different girls who do different things, who look very different, and there's always something new. I feel like the problem, and I'm not against OnlyFans at all, because I know people who do it, and I think that it's, if you want to have that outlet and use that, it's totally fine. But as the end user experience, I could see where it can become very, problematic when sometimes people are now thinking that like they know you, and they are getting something from you, and they've created this relationship with you, which is not a real relationship. Like I feel like that adds a whole new dynamic that's really scary.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because it's not just like, oh, I'm watching something. Now it's like personalized,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like you think that you might be even getting a personal message, and you may.
Well, can't they interact with the models?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had an OnlyFans,
Mm-hmm.
I could have an OnlyFans, which I don't, but just putting that out there. If I did, I could say like part of whatever I'm offering. I've never been on the platform, but I know people do different things. Right? Some people just post pictures,
Mm-hmm.
some people post videos, some people interact and send like messages.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have like agencies that send messages,
Mm-hmm.
right? But regardless, someone could think that they are interacting with you and having now this like relationship,
Mm-hmm.
which you as a creator are viewing just as a transaction because that's what you're doing as the creator. But now it's creating this other kind of false, like, I don't know what psychologically that's doing to people, but I feel like it's very scary.
Well, the way OnlyFans is affecting people within relationships at this point is it adds the idea of pornography is at least it's these people that we don't know, we don't interact with, and we don't have any accessibility to, right? But now if I'm logging into OnlyFans and I'm watching our neighbor or somebody that I know, it adds this element of, well, now they're crossing a line. This isn't just a third party person that we don't know. This is somebody that we do know. So now, to use your example, if Lauren Conlon has a OnlyFans page and you're friends with Lauren, and now you're interacting with Lauren through her OnlyFans page, it becomes this weird dynamic where people are like, I feel like you're cheating on me. And you're cheating on me with Lauren, our friend, or with whoever it is. And so it starts to open up this kind of Pandora's box of like going back to what is cheating, what isn't cheating, where is it crossing a line, and so you start to see a lot of these gray areas. And even if they don't know you personally, the fact that they can interact with the adult star at this point, which is essentially what OnlyFans is, adds a different layer of intimacy into it. So regardless of whether or not they actually know you, the fact that they can communicate with you, because in the past you couldn't communicate with an adult film star.
Yeah.
You had to go to like a seminar or whatever their expos are. Okay.
Now, to be fair, a lot of people who are using OnlyFans are not, we're not saying that everybody who's using OnlyFans
Right.
is posting videos like that. Clearly, that's not the case. But even if you're just posting like lingerie photos, the point still stands that you could be having these interactions with someone, which I would say is probably more psychologically detrimental to the end user potentially than even watching something that's more explicitly pornographic.
If we're having an honest conversation about OnlyFans, it's sexually driven, period.
Yes.
That's the majority of the content out there.
No, I know, but I'm
Right.
saying there's a difference of posting a lingerie photo versus like you're having a
Sure.
threesome.
Absolutely.
Obviously, there's
Yes.
a difference in
Yes.
the content that is being consumed in terms of like the
Mhm.
type of content. However, you know, even if you're watching like any type of pornographic video, but you're not interacting with someone,
Mhm.
or you're just looking at a lingerie photo, but you're interacting with someone, that's very different.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
In terms of what the end user is thinking,
Right.
or how they're feeling about it, which that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, that I feel like is very, it just makes me also scared for some of the creators, but that's a whole different conversation. They can worry about protecting themselves, but that would make me like so nervous, like, oh my gosh, someone thinks that they have this relationship with you and they know you, and then like what if they find out where you're at? Like, I don't know, that would just like be so horrifying to me. And I know that that's happened before. I'm sure of it. But so obviously access has increased in terms of being able, you know, just type, not like, okay, let's put the DVD in the you know, the trash can and go get it later, which is hilarious. Like, it's just such a great story. But accessibility is very, very different now. How would you say that has, I know you mentioned in the beginning, increase in sexual dysfunction. So how does that typically play out in terms of men and women?
Okay. So for men in particular, the way it works is this. In the past, when you had access to that Playboy, like you just were looking at that magazine and the 50 pictures that were in it. Okay, and usually it had like, there would be like 3 or 4 actresses at all through the entire thing. And so you were just looking at like 10 pictures of actress 1, 10 pictures of actress 2, etc. So it was the same, it was like 3 people that you were essentially looking at. And same thing with most adult videos back then. It was like 4 or 5 different actresses in it, and that was like, you only had that one videotape, so like you watched that one over and over again. So what happens is this, and you started to touch on it earlier when we were talking about like dopamine. Well, this is where addiction and porn begin to overlap. So nowadays what happens is a person logs into porn, a typical end user for pornography, whatever their website is that they go to. The second the website pulls up, it's not just like 3 pictures and they get to click and choose which one. There's 50 different profiles, right? And it ranges on across the board for what the content is going to be. So we're going to put content aside for right now, and we're just going to look at the fact that there's 50 images, 50 different women that you can watch. So what ends up happening in a typical like 30-minute experience with porn, people aren't just watching 1 or 2 videos and they're not watching them in their entirety. They're clicking a video, they're watching 30, 40 seconds of it, they're seeing if that arouses them. If it does, maybe they stick with it, maybe they don't, but more than likely they click off of it because they scroll to the bottom as they see the other recommended videos, and so they click that one, and then they click another one, and they keep clicking. Every click releases more dopamine, right? And so it just creates
sound
this.
familiar to any of the social media podcasts that we've talked about?
So it creates this loop where in a 30-minute space, if we're looking at it, they might click 50 or 60 different images. And so their brain is constantly being flooded with this. Now, what neurological researchers will show you, and this is common with addiction, right? If you picture, like if you were to have a piece of paper and just draw a line through the middle of that paper, and let's pretend that paper is baseline. So what happens is the first time somebody uses a drug or pornography, the first time you see it, that line shoots all the way up to the top, and it's like, that's like the peak. And so you're like, oh my God, this is great. And then you usually would drop back down to baseline, right? But the more you use something, what ends up happening is the peak doesn't go quite as high, but then the low ends up eventually dropping below baseline. So what you see is this like peak, baseline, peak, slightly below baseline, peak, slightly even more below baseline. And so you start to see this like, it go from being high on the left to being really low, so that the lows from the lack of dopamine or the overuse or overstimulation of it create like an off balance, where now you have to watch pornography just to feel normal again. And so it kind of resets this dopamine pathway that you receive pleasure. And this works with anything, and this is what addicts have been dealing with for a long time. The first high is really great, and so you keep doing it. This is what they used to call chasing, right? Chasing the high. And so they end up using the substance so much that the high actually becomes what used to be baseline. And then when you aren't using the substance or whatever it is, you drop so far below baseline. This is where you begin to see really unhealthy behaviors. You know, like it's disrupting sleep, it's disrupting appetite. Their compulsive behaviors begin to come out, and they start doing crazy things just to feel good again. They've lost touch with reality, and so they start doing whatever they can to get that dopamine response back just to feel normal. And so addiction with pornography plays in the same way. You start clicking images, right? And you start seeing all these images, your brain just starts getting flooded, like redhead, blonde, brunette, like Asian, Hispanic, American, like whatever your preference is. And so people just kind of get addicted to this cycle, and they can stay in this loop for hours and just click and click and click and click and click. And so it feeds that dopamine response, right?
And yeah, there's a non-stop stream of novelty.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think you really highlighted it so, you captured it so well there, where you said like before it used to be like, oh, you're looking at maybe 50 pictures, but with 3 people, you know, versus now you might be looking at 50 pictures, but with 50 people, which has a very different effect on like neurochemically how we're responding to something.
Right.
And then also how that overlays expectations for the real world.
Right.
Which it's like,
and
well, especially if you're in granted you're in a monogamous relationship, it's going to be one person, you know what I mean, who's not going to be able to obviously look like these 50 different people or act or whatever. Yeah. And you might not even want that. Like, it's not like you're like, you want that necessarily. You're not like, oh, I want you to be 50 different people for me. But subconsciously it's kind of eroded this to where you're like, oh, I love you, but like this is maybe boring. Like, is that kind of what you hear? Like, what do you hear from clients?
Yeah, so the increase in pornographic use, what it ends up doing is it leads to sexual dysfunction, and particularly in men. For men, the 2 most common sexual dysfunctions are premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction. And so what ends up happening, because they get stuck in this loop of dopamine response over and over again, they no longer feel the sensation or feel stimulated by just looking at one particular person, or more importantly, having sex with just that one person, because sex with that one person doesn't represent the level of stimulation that they were watching in pornography, and so they don't get an erection. It actually changes the neurochemical balance within the brain, and so they just don't get erections anymore. And so it's not that they don't want to have sex, it's that the only way they can get an erection is by watching pornography. And in fact, you're starting to see more and more studies of men preferring, especially with today's society, of men preferring not to date and just watching porn. They can stay home and they don't have to date, they don't have to spend money. It always kind of says yes, they can get whatever they want from it. The end result is the orgasm, so to speak, or the experience of sex, because they've become so sexualized that the only worthwhile virtue within a relationship is the sexual component. And so if they don't, there's no investment within the individual or within the relationship. And so, to make matters worse, to go back onto the topic scenario, is I remember looking at this when I was working with sex offenders. We pulled up like the top 10 titles, search titles for what pornography would be. We went to like Google and a couple other search engines, and all of it was deviant to some degree. It was like teens. Another big one was stepsons and stepdaughters. There was like family-esque pornography. And so what you also begin to see is this, and this is also where it starts to slant to the negative. Most people start off searching for just sexual content, right? But then what ends up happening is, and we talked about the desensitization of this stuff, is you start watching just normal heterosexual porn, guy on girl. But then that doesn't do it. You want to watch guy and girl, so you want to see threesomes. And then threesomes goes into threesomes with MILF and mother and daughter. And it goes into teen. And it goes into more aggressive sex. And so what used to be just watching a couple have sex is now very aggressive, right? It's more violent, it's more deviant. There's greater disparities in sexual coercion. So you're starting to watch more aggressive porn where they're slapping, hitting, choking, and not in like just kind of like semi-kinky ways. This is like where it's starting to become a borderline on abuse. And so you begin to see more deviant behavior start to play out, and that becomes the expectation for sexual performance. Mm-hmm. And here's the crazy part. It's not just in the end users. The actresses themselves are starting to experience real trauma as a result of being in the adult industry.
I was going to say, this has a trauma written all over it. But the problem is, because again, there's like this mismatch of like reality and this fantasy, right? Where, okay, if you're watching, I don't know, they didn't call it rape porn, probably not, but let's just call it that, right? Because there's definitely those kind of sub-contexts and subgroups, but this very violent pornographic material, right? Where clearly that is the aim of it, right? Is to be very violent. But when you're watching that, because it's still fake, like that person, in this case, like the male and the female, like the woman is looking like she is enjoying it, because that's part of it, right? Like, well, sort of. So, yes and no. But like, you're still like not. Yeah. I get what you're saying. You're doing it in a way. It's. How am I trying to phrase this? Like the tone is that like this is acceptable, and desirable, or that they want this, right? And everybody has different levels of kinks that they're into. Again, this is not a kink shaming thing. Like we all got our stuff that we're into, but there's levels to these things, right? Correct. And there's what I think is happening. What I would imagine is happening for people who are watching this is that over time that like erodes their sense of like what is reality, right? And like if they do that to someone who's maybe not like interested in that, you know what I mean? Or are they seeking people like there's just so many layers. I'm like trying to figure out how I want to conceptualize. Like, do you know what I'm saying? I think you know what I'm saying. I do, because what it's actually doing is it's reshaping the narrative in their head around sex and what is appropriate sex. Yeah, and it's between reality and fantasy. Yeah. And so the reality is most of the porn stars that you're watching, they don't have sex the way they do on camera at home. They're having sex the way most other people do. You know, but the difference becomes if the end user who's watching porn, and progressively over time the porn that they're watching is becoming more aggressive, more deviant, more violent,
that's what stimulates them. So if you meet somebody and you're dating and you come home, the first time you have sex with this person, it's not the sex that you've been watching.
Yeah.
You're not doing those things to that person, and usually, at least not initially.
Yeah, usually
right?
not the first, maybe the second time, not the first time. I'm gonna say that for the second date.
But so what it does is it starts to change the narrative, and
But the difference too is that there's a conversation when you're in a relationship or you're dating. Like
You
there's
hope
a
that
conversation. Well,
yeah,
you're hoping that there's a conversation like, hey, like this is like kind of what I'm into, or that like I would like if we did this, or we should try that, or like how do you feel about this, or whatever.
Yes.
That's very different. Like do whatever fucking weird shit you want to do. Like I'm all for it. But there's a difference of like having this conversation and both being in on this
mm-hmm.
and like creating that almost fantasy in your reality versus watching something where it's clearly like there's a different dynamic going on.
Yes. But I would also still warn you that some of the things you might even be talking about are really far outside of what is typical and normal for most people.
True.
Right? There's a difference between having kinks, and when you find two people who are sexually open and on the same page and vibing, that's great. And have at that. And by no means am I shaming anybody else's type of whatever their sexual pleasure or kink or whatever it would be, their fantasies are. Have your fantasies. But understand that sometimes what's happening with pornographic use is it's creating a fantasy that most people aren't going to be able to live up to or fulfill or feel comfortable fulfilling. This is stepping outside of like, I want you to wear a particular outfit or let's do a little bit of role play. That's not this. This is like where it can create trauma to the person. There's a podcast, I could send it to you if you wanted to link it, you can. There's an adult film actress, her name is Lana Rhoades. You ever heard of her?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. For those of you who don't know, at one point, very recently, Lana was the #1 rated porn star in the world. She was the most downloaded, most viewed, everything. She's quit the adult industry because of the trauma she's encountered in filming adult content. She did a podcast, I forget the name of the episode, I can find it and send it to you again if you wanted to link it, where she talks about the experiences that she's had in porn and how she got to be, she had her own trauma from earlier in her life, but like the content that she was filming, it just kept getting more and more explicit to the point where she felt so uncomfortable. She had to start seeing a therapist and going through all these things to get her own counseling. And she's completely backed out of the adult industry. And not just because of the long-term effects of what it means to be an adult film star and then try and, but just the idea that she was encountering so much trauma because the producers, the agents, the directors, whatever it was, kept asking her to do more and more deviant things. Mm-hmm. To the point where I think, what was it? She was asked to she was doing something where it induced vomiting, and then they asked her to drink the vomit. I did something along those lines. I remember playing it for the guys that were in prison because they would always idealize porn stars, and they were always like, this is what I want to do. And I was like, they're not always having fun, like what you're watching. And so playing that podcast where she's like, I didn't know to say no to certain things and didn't, and I felt, pressured by people and all this kind of stuff. And so you begin to see a very different side of pornography when you hear it from, and this isn't just some like random woman who tried it and then didn't like it. This was the #1 porn star in the world talking about the trauma that she encountered while filming porn.
Yeah. Because you have worked with people in prison before, which is obviously going to be a different population than your standard client who maybe is having some sexual dysfunction. Mm-hmm. How different is that experience? Like I know you just mentioned, like they kind of almost idealize this. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of through and through? Like you saw that with every one of those clients. Like obviously every client who comes to you now in your regular private practice is not going to be dealing with this, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of I guess like where is there like a jumping off point? Like where does it start to make a turn to where it really becomes like an issue? I guess like that's again like the whole point of this podcast is not to have people stop watching porn. It's more of just like how do we have an informed discussion about it? How do we have informed use? Same thing we have with anything. Like we've talked about dating apps before. We've talked about social media risks. It's all literally the same thing, just a different name. Mm-hmm. All of these things hijack the same exact systems in our brain, and they start to create these different realities out of these fantasies that are not true. Like with dating apps, you think that you have 100 options when you really don't. right? Like you just don't. But it seems like it's like this fabricated thing. Same thing with social media. It's going to be able to hijack like the types of information that you want to see or whatever kind of feedback that you're getting from it. Same thing with porn, right? Like there's all literally the exact same thing, just a different name. And the whole point of this is just to share so people know, okay, what am I kind of getting into? And this is, again, not to say that people can't watch porn in a normal and healthy fashion. But like, was there just kind of a difference with those type of clients? Like, did they always have like issues with it?
The difference in those clients,
high amount of consumption, like what, like
yeah, the difference. I mean,
obviously, there's so many other issues. I'm not saying that it's just because of
right. There's a variety of
There's a
factors
variety of
that play
factors.
into that, but like it's the fact that they themselves were exposed. Early sexualization is a big one. Trauma, lack of boundaries. No one telling them what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. No one having conversations about, what does consensual sex actually look like? When a person says no, what does that actually mean? The idea that, too, for them, the idea of feeling good and not having any level of empathy for the other person played a big role in it, in the sense of it doesn't matter. So this is where you began to see, like more pedophilia type stuff, right? Like that's where that they just didn't care. It was like, well, whatever's available to me is here for me to use and to experience pleasure from. And so it was just, it's a very different population, right? And so you have to like re-educate them and really go through like reparenting to a large degree of what is considered healthy consensual sex versus non-consensual sex. So there's a whole treatment, and we don't have to get down on that.
I was just kind of curious because it's like I was just wondering how much of a role you think that played, but I feel like it probably does.
Oh, it plays a huge role.
Yeah.
I mean, because most people are always going to stumble into sexual discovery at their own, and some people might discover it a little sooner, but, like, boys start recognizing, like, hey, like, I remember my son when he was like 3, I think. He was in the bathtub and he was like just, splashing around. And one day he was just on his stomach and he was moving around and he got up and he was like, look at my penis, Daddy. It's so hard. Like, why does that feel good? And I was like, okay, sit down. Don't be on your stomach anymore. No. But girls will discover it innocently too. Like they might be in the bathroom and like, why does wiping feel good all of a sudden? Like, and so you kind of stumble into it, and sexual discovery is a natural part of life. I think what's happening though is because kids have access on their phones and their parents aren't paying attention to internet consumption, like what normally used to be a Playboy is now Snapchat, is now Instagram. And if you don't think Instagram is overly sexual, like I don't know what you're looking at, because everything is like, and I'm not knocking men or women in this space, but like I can go to any woman who's an IFBB pro and I can pretty much see her standing almost completely naked, just covering her nipples and her vagina, and everything else is completely exposed. And it's like, that's a naked woman, and that's on almost every single page. You know what I'm saying? And men are doing
they might
the
not
same
be
thing.
sharing it in a sexual way.
I get it.
They might not be sharing it in a sexual way, which most of them aren't, but that doesn't mean that people aren't receiving it.
Correct.
You have no control over how someone's receiving it, right? So like obviously you can put something out that's explicitly, hey, I'm sharing like, my physique, this is what I do as a sport, but you don't know how other people could be receiving it that way, or they could be receiving this as that is a sexual message, and look at this person basically naked, or they just happen to stumble upon the picture and they don't even know what competing is, they're just like, oh, what's this? You know what I mean? Like this hot chick with great body, and they could just be like, oh, she's in a bikini, not thinking that it's,
and guys are doing it
what's
too.
12 weeks out? They don't know what that means, you know what I mean? Because the average person, while we are very familiar with that industry, it's still very niche in comparison to like most other sports, so yeah, it's definitely like the access, is the biggest one, and just I think how it changes how people perceive sex. So when people are coming in, like in terms of relationship issues, obviously outside of the normal dysfunction, right, which would be an obvious one, but like you said, that can be changed over time with decreased use, and kind of resensitization to regular life.
Reprogramming the brain a little bit, into what is typical healthy sexual behavior.
What would be some of the other kind of, what would you see as in terms of like relationship rifts with this? Like, is it just because like, outside of just the dysfunction, which is an obvious one,
Sure.
but like, what would be some of the other things that are common?
Well, for women in particular, it can create large amounts of insecurity. They're like, well, what you'll hear a lot is she'll say, well, I'm not this, beautiful model. I don't have her breast size. I don't have her body. I'm not willing to do these sexual things. And so it can feel very insecure, make you feel very inadequate. That he desires a plethora of women and I'm not good enough anymore. One person I'm not 20 different women.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be those things. And nor, especially whatever their other life stressors are that are playing a role in that space. And so, it also, again, is like a decrease in sexual activity, a decrease in intimacy. It helps remove people from the relationship because one of the ways a lot of people experience intimacy is not just through the act of sex, but through the kind of relational piece, the connection piece that occurs after sex. Mm-hmm. Holding the person, talking with that person, experiencing love with them. And just kind of being, vulnerable and in the same space and that connection that occurs, post-sex. And it's just not something that's happening. Men are detaching from the relationship. Sex is becoming more about a dopamine than it is about connection with love and intimacy and connecting to their partner. And so that's really the ways that it's that it is impacting relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so, not to mention the sexual dysfunction part.
Yeah, and when you mentioned it earlier, how there's some people who are just like opting for that, like they want that, like that just makes me so sad because it's like that is missing the whole like emotional intimacy piece that is so great that like can only happen when you're with somebody else. Like, that's literally the whole reason to be with someone else is like for that because you can't manufacture that any other ways. It just makes me really sad that people are so like in that headspace that they don't even want to try that,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean I understand like nobody likes being rejected, nobody likes heartache, like it's sometimes easier to be like, well, I put these walls up, I don't want to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
But like as like a choice for like a long-term choice, like, that's really really sad. And there was one more thing that I wanted to touch on before we wrap this up. So for anybody listening who now maybe this is the first time they're hearing this, or maybe you've heard a few podcasts like this and you're like, okay, maybe I like really need to like get myself in check here. What would be some, I guess, kind of checkpoints that you would suggest people either in terms of like managing consumption or kind of noticing like when is this becoming an issue? Just like some things to look out for.
Sure. I mean, again, these are just kind of general guidelines. Like, are you watching more pornography than you are having sex with your significant other? If you're coming home and you're watching porn on a daily basis, it's generally a problem. If you are receiving more sexual gratification from porn than you are from your current relationship, it's generally a problem, right? If I'm orgasming 3 or 4 times a week because I'm watching porn, but I'm having sex with my partner once or twice a month, like, where's the connection? Who are you spending more time with? Obviously, if you're watching porn and you're doing it in inappropriate places, like if you're watching porn at work, if you're watching it in the car, if you're kind of thinking about it, because it's very easy to start to fantasize and idealize, pornography. And so you kind of start to see that obsessive compulsive component with it, right? Like I'm not thinking about my spouse or my significant other as much as I am thinking about porn and porn stars and, what I'm going to do. And if you're subscribing to certain things like OnlyFans and you're not telling your spouse, you're keeping it more hidden, more secret, especially if you're starting to interact with the OnlyFans models or performers, you start to see just kind of a slippery slope of things. You should know that if you're unable to receive an erection from having sexual contact with that person, like there might be an issue. Porn might be creating that. And the other thing too, where people confuse, like, why is premature ejaculation a problem with porn? I don't understand that. Let me explain how this link works. Most people discover their sexuality as a part of growing in just natural biology, but we do it in secret, right? And so most of the time what ends up happening is sexuality by and large is shamed earlier in our life, right? We don't tell our parents that, hey, I just discovered what an orgasm was or what it was like to reach climax. And so most people start masturbating in the privacy of their own home, like in the bathroom, in their room, and they do it quietly, quickly, so no one will hear them or know what's going on. And so you're a child. And so what ends up happening is men in general, they start to get to climax very quickly because they're kind of programmed to, like mom's around the corner or dad's downstairs or whatever it is. And so what ends up happening is they program their bodies to reach climax very quickly. And a lot of people, when they're watching pornography, they start rewiring that part of them as well. They're like, oh, I'm gonna click. And if who's sitting down and watching porn for like a solid hour? Most people are like, I wanna get in and do my thing. So they click a few times, they do what they need to do, and then they're done. And so what ends up happening is it starts to reach climax quicker and quicker and quicker. And so it resets the body to where I can reach orgasm very quickly, but I don't have the ability to perform sexually anymore because I orgasmed too quick. Or the opposite side of that is they can't get an erection at all. And you have to retrain your brain. There's a lot of different things that you can start to do. We could do a podcast on that if you want, like male sexual performance.
Yeah, if you guys are interested in that, let us know. I know it's kind of niche, but also not really. Like, you know what I mean? Because it's
I don't know. Like, I think we definitely have more women who listen to the podcast, but they might have husbands and boyfriends who are struggling with this and might be like, oh, where do I go? And
yeah, because it's a lot of people don't want to bridge those conversations, but it's like they're important.
They're very embarrassing, and that's the point.
Yeah.
Everything is shrouded in shame.
Yeah, and then also I could imagine it's like the self-fulfilling loop of like, if now you're having problems, you then want to distance yourself from your partner because of the shame that you feel, so then you go listen to more, watch more porn.
Because it makes you feel good.
Yeah, and then it's
and then
the
the
cycle.
dopamine drops
like,
even lower, so you feel depressed. Yes, it creates a horrible cycle, which is why most people will tell you abstinence from porn, once you've reached an addiction space, becomes necessary.
Okay, that was going to be my last question, was if somebody has dealt with these issues in the past, is it like most, again, some people have, we're going to do a whole podcast on misuse of substances, right, which is next. There's obviously a difference of, I have some maybe too frequent use of something versus I've had a full-blown addiction with it, right? Very different. Typically an addict is going to have to almost always cease use and be completely abstinent from it. So would you say the same thing is probably true here? Like if you found yourself in this position to where you really are having issues in terms of like function and connectivity and everything, that it's probably just best to not consume at all?
Yeah, pornography is not something we actually need. So it's a luxury. Now, you can make the argument that sex is absolutely something we need. Great, and I'll be in favor of that too. And I would say sexual addiction in general is different from other addictions because it's the one addiction we actually have to learn to live within. Versus like alcohol and drugs, we can say, I don't need those. Yeah, and food.
You gotta eat.
Exactly.
So that's what makes it so hard.
So it becomes a different, like you can say gambling, drugs, alcohol, you can cut those out. You want those things. You don't actually need them. You just want them. But sex is a little different. However, pornography is not necessary for sex, so you don't need it. And so the idea becomes, all right, I've got to learn to get rid of this from my life. And when you stop watching pornography, you begin to see your sexual urges and desires for a person, an actual human being that you can have sex with, start to increase. Your sexual performance starts to come back. It can take some time, which is why maybe doing a podcast on this might be important, because it doesn't happen overnight. And so you're like, you've got to trust in this process. And I don't know, maybe this is similar to a person who's, going through their first prep or something like that, where they're like, I don't know what I'm going to look like. So you kind of just have to trust in the process and say like, look, over time, this is going to rewire itself and you will get better. You just need to stick with this. And so, but that's kind of what it looks like. And so you don't need pornography. And if you're unfortunately one of the people who can't control it, if you're like, hey, I can log in once or twice a month, do my thing, cool. Go have at it. Do whatever you want to do. And it doesn't affect your performance. It doesn't affect the way you view sex. Or, it doesn't change the way you view women in general, or your perception of relationships. Then awesome. No harm, no foul. It's kind of like the occasional person who goes to McDonald's. Like, it's not a bad thing. You enjoy it, go enjoy it. But it's not the same for every single person. And unfortunately, if you're a person who is coming home day after day and watching porn, like, you might have an addiction, and this might be, something that, as you decide, like, okay, this is an area of my life I want to address, like, abstinence, you might have to just cut it out. And, it's hard, it's difficult, but you can do it.
Yeah, I think that's really important, a really important message and a great way to finish this podcast. And I think we should do a topic on that because, you know, there's not a lot of people who want to even broach that subject. You know what I mean? So I think we should do it. So let us know if you guys agree that we should do a podcast on that. And yeah, I thought this was a really important discussion, and it's very nuanced, right? Like everything that we talk about, right? There's rarely something that's like this is. That's why we do this podcast, because literally everything is about nuance, which is why we're able to have that in a 30-minute to an hour discussion instead of just like this is good, this is bad. You know, you see so many things like these are terrible, and it's like there's probably more negatives that come from porn than positives, right?
Yes. By and large.
For the average person. But definitely just want it to be more of like an informed use kind of a thing, because I just think that there's just a lot of people don't start consuming porn thinking that it's going to have these issues. I would say most people aren't starting with that intention, you know?
Correct.
So if we can just inform more people, or if someone's just been noticing like, oh, I kind of am having some of these issues and maybe they haven't put that together quite yet, this could be the missing piece for you and your relationship. So thank you guys so much as always for listening. To contact Rick for counseling, where can they reach you if he remembers? He's so old.
FullCircleTherapyFL@gmail.com.
Rick is so old he can't remember his email.
Close to death.
Close to right around the corner.
Dying.
We got a few more podcasts in yet, right? We got to finish up at least today's episode or next episode, then you know whatever. But if you guys enjoyed this, please share it. That is the best way to help us grow our show. Like, subscribe, do all the things. And if you have any other questions for me, for the team, you can visit teamlogofit.com, and we will talk to you guys next week.